Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital Today channel. Trouble at the Brown Dog Bar began long before Jocelyn Jacks ever pushed open its sticky wooden door, long before Dalton staggered to his usual corner stool, and long before Vaughn decided tonight was the night he stepped out of the shadows. The night felt thick with the kind of tension that seemed to cling to Port Charles these days, a heaviness that followed every person connected to the Sidwell investigation or to Laura's battle for re-election. But inside the dim bar, none of that mattered to Dalton Holt, whose words slurred together like loose change spilling from a torn pocket as he bragged to the bartender about everything that had gone wrong in his day. When Joss joined him, sliding onto the bar stool with the easy confidence of someone who had rehearsed this whole act in the mirror, she cocked her head in that deliberately flirtatious way, pretending she hadn't expected him to be this drunk. Dalton, blinking rapidly to focus on her, grinned with the slow-witted pleasure of a man whose ego outweighed his common sense. "Look who's here," he drawled, reminding her that she was no longer his student, no longer his assistant, and certainly no longer someone he should be speaking freely around. And yet the alcohol kept his jaw loose and his guard down. Joss hummed sympathetically as Dalton rambled about Rocco Falconeri breaking into his lab earlier, demanding answers about animal testing, and how, of all people, his own grandmother, Mayor Laura Collins, didn't think Dalton should have to pay for the damage. Joss urged him on with carefully placed smiles and feigned admiration, and Dalton took the bait beautifully, confessing that after the disaster at his previous university, he no longer conducted any meaningful research on campus. His real work, he bragged, was happening in another facility, one PCU had no clue existed. Vaughn, sitting at a table behind them and pretending to nurse a beer, winced as Dalton grew handsy, squeezing Joss' thigh under the counter. Joss kept her composure, leaning in just enough to feed Dalton's ego as she coaxed more information out of him. He babbled about cheap rent around here, about a secluded building close enough for convenience but far enough that no one could hear the dogs barking at night. The implication hit Joss like a fist, but she didn't let the shock reach her eyes. If Dalton was telling the truth, and his drunkenness suggested he absolutely was, then the secret lab existed, and those animals were suffering right now. But before she could extract more, Gio and Emma walked into the bar, freezing as they spotted the scene unfolding. Joe's stomach dropped. Emma placed a hand on his arm, whispering that Joss knew exactly what she was doing. When Joss excused herself from Dalton to join them, Gio and Emma filled her in on what had happened to Rocco, how Dalton's lies had cornered him into a nightmare of criminal charges and humiliation. Dalton stumbled over, demanding Joss return to him, and Emma, unable to restrain herself, snapped, calling him a disgusting human being. She revealed that she had been the one who broke into Dalton's old university lab and that she had orchestrated tonight's infiltration too. The admission made Dalton's face contort with rage as he threatened to lock her up right beside Rocco. Emma responded by throwing a drink in his face, and for a split second the entire bar froze, waiting to see if Dalton would strike her. Instead, Vaughn stepped between them like a storm, flashed his WSB badge, and yanked Dalton away, telling him to show up at the station in the morning. The revelation of Vaughn's true identity stunned Emma and Gio, who spiraled into guilt over dragging Rocco into something the WSB had apparently been monitoring all along. Joss insisted they were wrong, the truth wouldn't have come out without their involvement. Meanwhile, across town at Windmere, Britt Westbourne's stress was building to a breaking point. Sidwell tried to reassure her that neither Dalton nor Rocco mattered compared to the larger mission, reminding her that without him she would be dead already. The medicine he supplied to keep her condition stable was the only reason she could still breathe without fear. Britt snapped back that she had never chosen to be part of Sidwell's operation. One moment she had been dying in her mother's arms, the next she was waking up in the Five Poppies compound, alive, but beholden to men with no morals. Sidwell argued that she would have left Port Charles anyway, and that all he had asked was that she continue the work her father started. But Britt refused to let Dalton's recklessness destroy Rocco's life. Their argument was interrupted when Dalton burst into Windmere, sweaty, stumbling, reeking of whiskey, ranting that the WSB was after him. Sidwell looked at him with sudden calculation. At the PCPD, Charlotte and Danny sat in the interrogation room, whispering like conspirators. Charlotte declared she had a plan, not just to free her brother Rocco, but to destroy Dalton completely. Her proposal: lie and say Dalton hit Rocco. Danny balked at first, but Charlotte performed the lie with such trembling, Oscar-worthy terror that Danny muttered his parents truly had no idea who their daughter really was. Lulu, Dante, Sunny, Jason, Rick, and Alexis debated the risks in Dante's office. Sunny insisted the kids were Rocco's only shot, and Jason agreed. Lulu cornered Charlotte privately, asking if she truly understood what she was doing. Charlotte did, terrifyingly well. Back at Laura's office, Jordan and Laura monitored the election results. Laura apologized for letting Jordan get embroiled in the Sidwell mess, but Jordan insisted it had been her choice. Drew entered abruptly, mocking Laura about writing a concession speech and demanding she endorse Ezra in her defeat. Laura glared at him, disgusted that the man she once respected had become Sidwell's puppet. They clashed viciously, about Sunny, about corruption, about loyalty, about the responsibilities of power, until Jordan rushed in with the election results. Laura had won. By a narrow but decisive margin. Drew's fury simmered hot and silent beneath his smile. Meanwhile, at the Brown Dog, Emma thanked Joss for uncovering the existence of the second lab. Outside, Vaughn kissed Joss in a whirlwind of adrenaline and gratitude. At the station, Charlotte and Danny prepared to testify. Nathan asked where they'd gotten Britt's key fob, and their answer, picking it off her person, made the adults exchange worried looks. Rick privately begged Sunny not to make Dalton disappear. But at Windmere, that decision had already been made. Britt stood over Dalton, listing every way he had jeopardized the operation, lying to the police, destroying the lab to frame a kid, and running his mouth to anyone with ears. She told him they didn't need him, that she could perform his tasks effortlessly. Sidwell, calm as a surgeon, removed a gun from his coat and shot Dalton in the chest. Britt gasped as Dalton collapsed, his blood spreading across the marble like an accusation. At that exact moment, across the city, Laura Collins was standing before a cheering crowd, thanking Port Charles for granting her another 4 years. But in the shadows of Windmere, as Dalton's breath rattled its last, a terrible truth settled like dust. The trouble at the Brown Dog Bar had given Laura something she never expected, a living witness, a thread connecting Dalton's drunken admissions to the secret lab, the animal abuse, the break-ins, and Sidwell's empire. And now that someone in Port Charles knew the truth, the entire operation was on the verge of collapsing. What no one yet realized was that Dalton's death would ignite a chain reaction that would threaten to burn every secret, every alliance, and every lie to ash. Because someone else had witnessed the shooting, someone who was about to change everything for Laura Collins, for Port Charles, and for Sidwell's entire organization. But Dalton Holt's collapse on the marble floor of Windmere was not the end of the night's unraveling, it was the beginning of a storm gathering speed, fury, and consequence across every corner of Port Charles. As Sidwell stood over Dalton's twitching body, his expression unnervingly calm, Britt staggered backward, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. She had known Sidwell was cold, calculating, ruthless even, but she had convinced herself he was not the sort of man who would spill blood unless absolutely necessary. This felt unnecessary to her, reckless, loud, messy. The sound of the gunshot seemed still to vibrate in the air, as if the walls themselves hadn't decided how to absorb what they'd just witnessed. Dalton groaned faintly, and Britt instinctively dropped to her knees, pressing her trembling fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse she wasn't sure she even wanted to find. A faint flutter answered her, weak, irregular, but undeniably present. "He's alive," she whispered, half in awe, half in dread. Sidwell, however, didn't flinch. "Not for long," he said, turning away as though Dalton were nothing more than a chore he had just completed. But before he could take 3 steps, a sound echoed from the doorway, a soft gasp, quickly stifled. Britt's head snapped up. Sidwell stiffened. A shadow shifted in the dim light beyond the archway. Someone had been there. Someone had seen everything. Panic surged through Britt, dread snaking up her spine like ice. If the witness went to the police, the operation was done. If they talked to Laura, who had just been re-elected on a platform built on integrity and transparency, Sidwell would never survive the fallout. For a terrifying moment, no one moved. Then Sidwell lunged toward the door, but the figure was already gone, slipping through Windmere's labyrinthine hallways like smoke. Britt pressed her hand harder against Dalton's chest wound, trying to stem the bleeding despite knowing Sidwell would rather let him die than risk him talking. "Find them," Britt hissed. "If they go public," Sidwell shot her a cold look. "I know exactly what's at stake. Keep him breathing until I decide otherwise." Across town, the Brown Dog Bar had begun to thin out as last call approached, but the ripple effects of Dalton's earlier meltdown were just beginning to hit. Emma couldn't shake the image of Vaughn dragging Dalton out, or the way Joss had walked away with Vaughn afterward, silently exchanging intel like two spies in an alleyway. Gio felt sick with guilt, watching Joss's revelation crumble the narrative he and Emma had built around their rebellion. Rocco shouldn't be in lockup. None of their actions had been necessary. And yet, if Dalton truly had a second lab, and if he was experimenting on animals, wasn't it better that they acted? Joss had told them they were wrong earlier, but now Gio wasn't sure whether she was protecting them or protecting herself. He knew Joss better than most, her instinct for justice was fierce, sometimes reckless. And something in her eyes tonight had looked shaken, frightened even. But Joss had left with Vaughn, and Gio and Emma were left in the bar, wrestling with guilt, fear, and the realization that everything was spiraling much faster than any of them could control. At the PCPD, Charlotte and Danny overheard their parents arguing outside the interrogation room. Charlotte pressed her ear to the glass, her brows furrowing as she picked up fragments: Sidwell, secret labs, WSB involvement. She pulled Danny closer, whispering that whatever was happening was bigger than Rocco, bigger than their lie, bigger even than what they had planned. Danny swallowed hard. He'd always been brave, forced to be, with parents constantly in danger, but tonight felt like a test he hadn't studied for. Charlotte, meanwhile, felt electrified. If the WSB was circling, if Sidwell was involved, if Dalton was unraveling, then their lie might not even be necessary. All they had to do was push at the right moment and the whole tower might fall. In Dante's office, Sonny paced like a caged lion while Rick reviewed his legal strategy. Jason remained silent, arms folded, leaning back in his chair as he processed everything. Lulu sat beside Dante, holding his hand as they argued about the kids' involvement. When Alexis burst in waving a new report, the room fell silent. "Forensics found something," she said breathlessly. "Dalton wasn't just covering up the lab break-in. He tampered with the evidence." Everyone's eyes widened. Sonny muttered, "He was desperate." Jason asked, "Was?" Lulu looked sharply at him. "What do you mean was?" But before Jason could explain, a frantic officer rushed in. "Commissioner, someone just called in an anonymous tip about Windmere," he said. "They reported a gunshot." Dante shot out of his chair. "Who?" They hung up before giving a name. "But they said Dalton Holt has been shot." A stunned silence swallowed the room. Dante, Sonny, and Jason exchanged one look, and they all moved at once. Back at Laura's election headquarters, the celebration was still roaring, champagne popping, supporters cheering her unexpected victory over Ezra. Jordan hugged her, proud and relieved, but Laura couldn't shake the unease tightening her stomach. Vaughn had texted her earlier, "Call me when you can. It's urgent." She hadn't had a chance yet. Drew's glare burned into her from across the room. His jaw twitched with fury, humiliation, and something darker Laura couldn't quite place. Laura excused herself, stepping into a quiet hallway, dialing Vaughn. He answered sounding breathless. "Madam Mayor, you need to hear this." As Vaughn recounted everything, Dalton's drunken confessions, Joss's discovery of the secret lab, the WSB surveillance, and now the anonymous tip about a gunshot at Windmere, Laura felt her pulse accelerate. Everything she had suspected about Sidwell was beginning to crystallize into something real, something dangerous, something that could topple the entire political structure of Port Charles. And then Vaughn said something that made Laura go cold. Dalton said he wasn't working alone. He hinted someone in your administration was protecting Sidwell. Laura gripped the phone. "Who?" Vaughn hesitated. "He didn't say the name. But Laura, it was someone close. Laura closed her eyes. Her victory suddenly felt hollow. If someone inside her circle was tied to Sidwell, then her administration was compromised. Her safety was compromised. And now Dalton, her grandson's professor, the man at the center of the entire mess, was possibly dying. Or already dead. Across the harbor, as Dante, Sonny, Jason, and a team of officers stormed Windermere, Britt dragged Dalton's body behind a couch, her hands slick with blood as she desperately tried to keep him alive. Sidwell had vanished deeper into the estate, hunting the witness. But he was too late. The witness, a trembling, wide-eyed Esme Prince, slipped into the boathouse, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had come to Windermere to confront Britt about her suspicions, never expecting to witness a murder. Esme knew she couldn't go to the police, not with her past, not with her reputation. But she also couldn't let Sidwell get away with this. She clutched her phone, praying the officers would arrive before Sidwell found her. When the PCPD burst into the mansion moments later, Britt screamed for help, pointing them to Dalton. Dante rushed to her side, ordering EMTs to be called immediately. Jason scanned the room, noticing the blood trail and the direction it led. Sonny's eyes hardened. "Where's Sidwell?" Britt trembled. "He went after the witness." "Who?" Jason demanded. Britt hesitated. She didn't want to give Esme up. Esme had been trying to help. But before she could answer, a gunshot cracked from the direction of the boathouse. Jason sprinted ahead of everyone, Dante right behind him. They burst in to find Esme on the ground, hands over her ears, Sidwell standing over her, gun raised for the kill. Jason didn't hesitate, he tackled Sidwell, the gun skidding across the floor. Dante went for the weapon, kicking it out of reach, and officers swarmed in, wrestling Sidwell into handcuffs. Esme sobbed in relief, pointing toward Windermere. "He shot Dalton, he was going to kill me too," he said. "No witnesses." Dante assured her she was safe now. For the first time in a long time, Esme believed it. Back inside, EMTs wheeled Dalton out, barely clinging to life but conscious enough to mutter something unintelligible. Britt leaned over him, whispering that he needed to hold on, that he wasn't allowed to die yet, not before telling the truth. But Dalton's gaze shifted toward Dante. "Lab, secret lab." "Sidwell." Dante leaned closer. "Where?" Dalton coughed violently, blood staining his lips. "Brown Dog Bar, told her, she knows." "Who?" Dante asked. Dalton's eyes rolled back. His answer died on his tongue. But Dante didn't need him to finish. He already knew. Jocelyn Jacks had been the last person to get information out of Dalton. And now she was the key to everything. As the chaos settled, Sonny looked at Jason with a grim, knowing expression. "This isn't over," he said. "Not even close." Jason nodded. "Laura's going to need protection." Sonny replied, "So is Joss." But while the officers swarmed Windermere and EMTs fought to keep Dalton alive long enough to reach GH, another wave of consequences was already spreading outward, creeping across Port Charles like fog rolling in from the docks. As soon as Dante radioed in that Dalton was alive, barely, and that Esme Prince had come forward as a witness to the shooting, Laura Collins was escorted out of her election celebration by two security officers who insisted it was no longer safe for her to remain in a public space. Vaughn met her outside, the tension in his face telling her the situation was even worse than she feared. "Sidwell is in custody, but this isn't over," he warned her in a low voice. Laura nodded, feeling the weight of her new term crash onto her shoulders far earlier than she had anticipated. She climbed into the back of the security vehicle and stared out the window as Port Charles raced past, streetlights blurring into streaks of yellow. Somewhere out there, her grandson Rocco was still locked up, her city was still under threat, and her enemies were still embedded in places she had yet to uncover. The moment Laura arrived at the PCPD, chaos hit her like a wave. Officers ran in every direction, phones rang non-stop, reporters crowded outside the entrance demanding statements, and alarms seemed to blare from every hallway. Dante, in the midst of ordering Esme to be taken to a secure room, spotted Laura and rushed over. "We think Dalton was about to flip on Sidwell," Dante said urgently. Esme saw the shooting. "If Dalton survives, we may finally get the full map of Sidwell's network." Laura exhaled in sharp relief. "And if he doesn't?" Dante hesitated. "Then Esme's testimony is all we've got. And she's fragile right now. Terrified." Laura nodded. "Handle her with care. She's not the same girl she used to be." Meanwhile, Jocelyn Jacks was pacing in her bedroom at Carly's house, replaying Vaughn's kiss over and over, feeling equal parts exhilarated and nauseated. She had done dangerous things before, but tonight had felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. She had no idea that Dalton's drunken ramblings in the bar had already turned into a life-and-death scenario across the harbor. She had gone home early, thinking Vaughn would text her with a debrief in the morning, but instead she found herself wide awake, checking her phone every 2 minutes, unable to shake the sense that something had gone very, very wrong. And she was right. Because while she paced, Dante was dialing her number. When she saw the PCPD caller ID, her stomach dropped. "Jocelyn Jacks," Dante said when she answered, "you need to get down to the station. Now." Joss's voice cracked.